Today on Behind the Tune.
Something a little bit different. You know, do car stuff, man. What's going on, guys? Matt at Middleton Motorsports here. Another episode of Behind the Tune. On the dyno behind me today. Something a little bit different. Let's flip the camera around here. So this is a 1978 Caprice Classic two-door. And it's got a set of 24s on it. So this is kind of getting into the realm of a big wheel car. What these guys would probably call a box Chevy. I know a lot of people want to call this a Donk, but I believe the Donk is actually 71 to 76. And I'm trying to be right with this community, because I know that guys get kind of picky about what's what when it comes to the big tire cars, the big wheel cars. So this, I believe, is a box Chevy. 71 to 76 would be a Donk. 77 and up with square headlights, I believe they call a box. So that's what I'm calling it. Pretty sure that's what the guys call it. But yeah, this has got some other stuff other than just the wheels. I think this is a pretty cool deal. I haven't done really a lot of these cars. I've done a couple in the past, but you can see it does not have probably what it came stock. These probably would have came stock with a smaller V8. This is a big block Chevy. So this particular engine is an earlier block. So this is a 396 block. What would have been late 60s. But this is bored over to a 427 from what my understanding. And does have a camshaft in it, 232, 238. It does have a set of aluminum heads on it. It has a Victor EFI intake on it, so single plane with I believe it's a Holley throttle body. Does have fuel injection on it, so this is Holley Terminator X Max. So behind this is actually a 6L80 transmission out of a later model Chevrolet, with a stock TCM inside the transmission controlling that. And the Holley X Max can talk to those T43 TCMs that's in a 6L 80 and 90 over a CAN bus, and provide the proper information as far as torque and throttle position, RPM, all that stuff, so it knows when to shift. So had to do a little bit of configuring with that. There is paddle shifters on this even. So paddle shifters, I got those working. You can see it's got the steering wheel, of course, that matches the rims on it. Got to have that. So anyway, back to this. So you can see it's got serpentine drive. It's got a bunch of it's got headers on it, obviously. It's got a dual exhaust, 2.5-inch exhaust with an H-pipe. So it's got a real good sound to it. So this does have also, it's kind of, when you're trying to blend one of these older engines that originally had a carburetor on it, typically this is one of the ways to do it. I actually like this way of doing it. There's also the sniper systems that kind of mimic the carburetor with fuel being injected right into the unit. This has port injectors because it's a Terminator, but this also does have a distributor. It's an MSD distributor, so it's a locked distributor, so the timing gets basically set between the Terminator and the distributor. Another trick with these is when you're doing that, there's a bunch of stuff you have to do. So you have to verify, basically what you do is verify top dead center on the balancer with, obviously with the piston. So you use a piston stop. I kind of use a camera and a piston stop to get it close. And then, I did verify that the balancer is correct. So there's a nice timing pointer on it. That was making my life easy. And then you have to phase the distributor and the actual rotor. So you buy a phasable rotor under the distributor cap. So your rotor is pointing at the terminals while the coil is sending spark through, and so you're not jumping spark across and you can wind up with something that's banging and popping, which this car was kind of doing at first, and I had to kind of go back through that procedure and reset that stuff to make sure that we had all that synced up properly. So that was all set right away from the beginning. There's also some inductive delay settings you have to go through in the Holley. Typically in the distributors, you're around 100 microseconds, which this was set to 60, which would have been for basically a different setup, but I'd adjusted that. That reduces the amount of lag you have when you start putting RPM into it. Basically the delay from the sensor in the distributor telling the Holly and the MSD kind of the delay and all that stuff going back by the time the coil is actually sparking to back to the cap. I know that stuff is happening kind of all at the speed of light essentially, but since there's a lot of processes going on, there's a tiny little bit of delay, and I actually was getting a little bit of a timing lag on it towards the top of the RPM. I was getting about 4 degrees of lag, so we did have to make an adjustment on the inductive delay. That was part of it. Again, that's all part of the tuning process. When you got combinations like this, you got to try to make all this stuff work together. But I've done this stuff before, and I've taken the long way around enough on stuff like this and learned how to get this stuff to work together so I can, when I bring something like this into the shop, I just have a plan of attack right away as to where to go, and I have a process to do it. So I've done it enough times. So we got all that set. Timing's correct. It's reading correct on my timing light. And yes, I do have a timing light still because of stuff like this. Every once in a while, I'll break that out, and some of these guys are like, oh my gosh, timing light, and isn't this fuel injected? And I'm like, yeah, but you still got to verify stuff. And it's even a nice thing to have when you're doing standalones on race cars, you know, especially when you got high RPM stuff, you're turning 8,500 plus, and you're putting a standalone on. Sometimes it's nice to verify timing of the timing light, because you start talking 1 or 2 degrees of timing on fast stuff with high boost, and that can get you in trouble if it's not accurate. So anyway, so yeah, got all that, all the phasing is correct, timing's correct. I also make an adjustment on these progressive linkages. A lot of the time I'll add a little bit of, especially on these single plane intakes with port injectors, sometimes these can be a little bit tricky. With the, got a camshaft, some overlap, and these big blocks, they're, with a bigger cam, they got a big port, and the ports can be pretty lazy, and there can be a lot of fuel standoff kind of moving around on the ports. This car isn't too bad, but I did play with the injection timing. But what can happen is when you have progressive linkage on a single plane, you have basically just the front two blades are opening the first 20% throttle, and then it'll open the rear blades. While you're just opening those front blades, you're kind of getting a bias of air towards the front of that air plenum inside the single plane intake, and that can bias air to the front cylinders or whatever cylinders are near it, where again, since you got cam and overlap, you got air kind of bouncing around in there, and you kind of end up with some kind of choppy running even at light throttle, 1800, 2000 RPM, where you want to kind of cruise down the road. So sometimes I'll introduce a little bit more opening on the rear throttle blade, which there is a throttle stop for the rear two throttle plates on the rear shaft. Sometimes that can help smooth some stuff out, especially coming back to idle. That's another trick I've learned on the progressive linkages. And sometimes you just got to get rid of the progressive linkage and go right to just a straight, all four of them are opening at the same time. Just kind of depends on the setup. It really depends on the setup. It can vary. I got this thing running pretty good just by adding a little bit more opening on the rears. So when it comes back to idle, the rear maybe is just a tiny bit more open, and as you come off idle, you kind of have like an equal amount, and then you kind of pass through a spot where off idle is where the equal amount of throttling opening is, and between the front and rear throttle shafts on that 4-barrel throttle body. That's just some tricks I've learned in the past on these things to try to make these types of setups run as best they can for street use, because you're kind of, the intake manifolds like this were not really ever designed to have port injectors. I know Edelbrock does make that, and they added bosses to put injectors in, but you still got unequal length runners, and the runner lengths inside that intake manifold have longer to the ends, and again you put the throttle body that's opening two blades first, then the rear blades, and so you introduce some kind of goofy stuff going on in that intake manifold where air is kind of bouncing around and fuel is being injected right at the valve. So depending on when you're injecting the fuel can really make a difference on how the car runs. Wide open throttle, not so much, but I'm talking light throttle, just off idle, and like light throttle cruise, fuel economy, and transitions too when you're coming on and off the throttle. Like if you're in traffic, you're coming on the throttle, like traffic starts to move in front of you, and then maybe somebody touches the brakes and you got to let off and then get back on it. Those little transitions like that, where when you're driving your modern vehicle, you're never paying attention to it, but when you're trying to tune something like this, it can start to get a little tricky, because you got a lot of rogue fuel bouncing around inside that intake plenum, and depending on what cylinders are firing and what cylinders are drawing air in and what cylinders are on the overlap between the exhaust and intake, there's going to be kind of fuel bouncing back and forth, and some cylinders are grabbing fuel from another cylinder's fuel standoff, and that's where it can kind of get funky. So trying to time all that stuff so you're kind of smoothing all those pulses out as best you can. Yeah, it can be tricky, but you play around with enough of this stuff over the years, and you kind of find the sweet spot for it and kind of know, depending on what combination. Sometimes you even have to get into individual cylinder tuning, and then it gets real tricky with really big camshafts. I've done some of that Copo stuff, the 632 stuff, and it gets real crazy with how much fuel. You can have 30% bias at off idle from one cylinder to another because of the standoff coming back, bouncing off a valve, and then the adjacent cylinder that's drawing air in wants to draw fuel in, that just bounced back off of a valve or got pushed back off from the overlap back through the intake valve before it shut, and the cylinder next to it's drawing that fuel in, and that gets a big shot of extra fuel, and yeah, it gets real messy. So tricks of the trade on port injecting single plane carbureted intakes. It can get pretty tricky with bigger cams. This is, like I said, for a big block Chevy, a 238, 232 on the intake, 230 on the exhaust at 50. It's kind of a moderate cam for a 427 cubic inch big block. So yeah, I know I'm kind of digressing, but I like to kind of talk about this stuff because I don't do a lot of this on the channel. A lot of this is late model injection with, superchargers or plastic style long runner intakes where you don't really have this problem. Injection timing does become an issue with camshafts and stuff, and sometimes you got to mess with it a little bit. But on these types of setups, when the fuel is sprayed in relation to when the intake valve opens, can make a big difference on how they run. So it's something to pay attention to when you're doing stuff like this. I know a lot of guys will just kind of glaze over that, and Holley has a basically you type in the cam specs and it just gives you that table, which it'll make it run okay, but improvements can be made by tweaking that table a little bit. So on this car, I did play with that quite a bit, and again, typically you have to on a single plane intake with these short runners. So anyway, I think that pretty much covers it under the hood here. Yeah, so not a super crazy exotic setup. It's got a nice cam chop to it, but kind of just your typical top end style big block build. I know this does have some bottom end work, but it's 10-to-1 compression, pump gas use, street car motor. Nothing super crazy. It's got a nice serpentine drive system on it. Aluminum radiator, dual fans. Again, something you can cruise around in. Obviously, it's got air conditioning that's going to get hooked up at some point. Yeah, you want to be able to cruise around in the summer. Hit the cruise spot, hit the parking lots, whatever, and go hang out and do car stuff, man. So dyno wise, this is where we're at. So you're thinking, I know you guys are thinking, oh, big engine. Where's the power? This is actually about what I expected, maybe a tiny bit short, but about what I expected on something like this. Until you get, flat tappet cams, it's got that 6-speed trans, it's got the big wheels. Now the big wheels are gonna sap up a lot of the power, honestly. It's got a 373 gear in it, so nothing too crazy on a gear, but the 6L transmissions do not have a 1-to-1. I do 4th gear, and 4th gear is a 1.15, so there's no direct drive gear on a 6L transmission like there is on an 8L or a 10L or a 10R. And so they tend to dyno pretty low, even like if you have a 5th gen Camaro or that generation C6 Corvette. The automatics will always make 20 or 30 horsepower at the rear wheels less than a manual will, or I should say even 20 or 30 less than what an 8 or 10 speed would make, simply because there just isn't a 1-to-1 ratio. And the fact that we're kind of a low compression for a big block, camshaft is kind of moderate. It's got kind of like a mid-length style header on it. There's a lot of stuff that's not where this isn't going to make 500 through rear wheels. There's a lot of reasons why it's not going to make that kind of power. So I'm calling this probably 450, maybe closer to 500 at the engine, which is what you got to kind of expect on a 390 or a 427 like this. About 500 at the crankshaft would be probably pretty close to what this is making right now. So, you know, with all that stuff that's kind of going against us, reading at the rear tires, the transmission, I am locking the torque converter. It does have a billet torque converter in it, so we can lock that up at wide open throttle. So I do have that locked. But with the big wheels on it, these tires are, these wheels, this overall diameter on these wheels is 31 inches. So it's a very tall tire. And a lot of, again, I talked about this before on the channel, a lot of our parasitic losses that we're reading on the rear tire of a dyno like this is the tire and the wheel itself and the friction of the wheel on that roller. So wheel size and tire compound play a big difference. So we got big wheels on this. It's going to make a big difference on what we're reading here. So again, I'm just more after, not always after a peak number and what we're making. I'm just after getting the tune dialed in properly, getting the car run properly, shift points, all that stuff. That's what really my use of the dyno is. It's not always to try to make as big of a horsepower number as I can. So timing wise, I even had Doug come over and video a run with the timing light aiming right at the pointer, and I got a really good sense of where we are in the timing, and we did a couple of those to verify that inductive delay I talked about, and I did have to adjust that a little bit, and I am at 35 degrees of timing up at the top here. I got about 30 degrees down the bottom, and it's ramping up to, it's hitting about 35 degrees, about 4,500 RPM, so we're 35 all the way up here. And I could go maybe a little higher, but I want to be able to have this car run on 91 octane. We don't always have good 93 near us here, and I know guys want to just be able to pull up to a gas station. Excuse me. Got a little bit of a cold right now. Sorry guys, I'm a little hoarse. And just put whatever premium they got, and that's typically 91 around where we are in the Madison area. So yeah, I'm not pushing the timing super hard. There's no reason to. Again, if we're trying, this isn't a race car. We're not trying to squeeze another 8 horsepower out of it. So there's no point. It's big, heavy. You know, it's probably a 4,000 pound car, and there's no point to wringing its neck out to try to make a couple extra horsepower. So I'm very comfortable where it's at timing wise now. I got the air fuel dialed in really nice on the Holly. Commanding 12.5 to 1. I know it's a little rich. Maybe I could go a little bit leaner, but again, I'd rather be safe. You know, could we maybe squeeze this thing up to 310 horsepower with leaner mixture and more timing? Probably, but it's not going to make a difference. And then we're just risking something happening to, you know, an engine build like this that probably, even though it's, you know, nothing super crazy, it's still expensive. You know, stuff like this costs money to build. It's, you know, nowadays machine work's expensive, and there's no point in pushing something to where you're going to break it. And I want to be able to have this guy be able to take it out and have fun and beat on it and do burnouts, whatever you want to do with it, maybe take it to the drag strip and have it live a long, happy life. So this is where I'm happy with it. This is where I'm going to leave it. We're going to do one more pull though, so you guys can see a pull on this thing. And it's been cooling off a little bit. It might make a little bit more. Sometimes that doesn't always work. Sometimes on a carburetor intakes like this, the heat actually helps with fuel atomization. So I'm expecting it to make about the same power. So yeah, I'm gonna set the camera down, and we'll do another rip on it, and then we'll take a look at the data log on the Holly, and yeah, we'll finish this one up. I got to take it for a drive tomorrow. I got to do more of the transmission tuning on it. I got a pretty good base on the trans tuning. Does have paddle shifting. I did get the paddles working on it. Of course, it's got to have the matching steering wheel there. That's super cool. But it's got some nice billet aluminum paddles. I got those working. I did have to, and I will mention this too, because this does have a 6L80 trans, the Hollys don't directly control the transmission on these. They actually, like I said, they provide the information needed to the stock transmission module. So I had to do a little bit of configuring with HP tuners in the stock transmission module. There is an OBD2 port for that, which they did wire in. But I was able to configure the stock TCM that's in the stock trans inside the valve body on those to accept the paddles, and luckily they had wired all that stuff up correctly, and I got it to work. So the paddles do work on this now, and I'm basically paddling it up in manual mode into 4th gear, and the way I set it up is in manual mode it'll lock the torque converter, and when you roll on the throttle to the floor it stays there. It doesn't try to downshift or anything crazy. It's true manual mode. So I got most of that already set up, but I do got to go out and verify the automatic points but I got a good baseline in it. So, but I got another car to dyno tomorrow, so I'll probably be on the dyno tomorrow, and this guy was in no rush, so I can do a little more street tuning on this. But for now, let's do a pull, and we'll get the dyno portion of this wrapped up. All right, guys, I actually ended up doing 2. You probably just saw the last one there. I just did 2 back to back. I had a little, kind of a goofy little drop at the top. Let me get the camera centered up and you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And so on the blue run, something happened here where it kind of dropped off a little bit. And then I just went back through and did 1 more back to back, and it pretty much came back. So I think it just needed a little more temperature in it. I'd let it sit for about 45 minutes. I was helping the other guys with some stuff and talking to some people, and got a little cold. So I think I kind of pulled that blue run there a little bit cold. So, but yeah, now it's looking good. Backed it up with a 300, 323 torque, so made a smidge more torque. But you can see, you know, the general idea of the curve is looking pretty much the same. Yeah, so like I said, I'm really happy where we're at fueling and timing wise on this. I think we're in an optimal spot for safety and you know, just basic street driving. So let's take a look at the data log. I pulled that up before I jumped out of the car. Basic stuff, data logged here. NA car, so we're not looking at a bunch of stuff. So red line is RPM. This kind of lighter blue line here is timing. And the yellow line is the commanded air fuel, so that's right at 12.5 to 1, the whole pull. And this lighter blue, kind of tealish looking line, that's the actual air fuel. So you can see we're pretty much riding that the whole time. You know, the Holley data here is pretty much just raw air fuel data, so you're going to get some jumps. Again, especially on a setup like this where we're, you know, a single plane intake manifold where fuel distribution is not the greatest. I tend to want to run these a little richer because the fuel distribution can be cylinder to cylinder, can be, I've seen over a half a point. So again, I could probably command 13 to 1 and maybe pick up a little power, but then you got some cylinders that are running probably a little too lean. I'd rather have it a smidge rich, and you know, just so, you know, yeah, maybe some of the cylinders are 11.9 and some of the cylinders are, you know, 12.7, 12.8, but we're all safe on all cylinders. Again, that's just experience of mine where you start looking at individual cylinder. You have instances where you're looking at individual cylinder air fuel ratio or EGTs, and just past experience, I like leaving setups like this a little rich. Again, it's not a race car. We're not trying to win a race. We're not trying to set the world on fire here. We're just want to make this safe and drivable. So, so timing, yeah, you can see I'm 35 degrees at the top. I'm bringing that in. I have, and again, in the past, I know a lot of these guys, you know, they think big block, small block Chevy, big cam, just lock the timing out. Well, with some of the knock stuff that I've had in the past and reading plugs and all that type of stuff, again, pump gas 91, you still have to be careful with it. And I still like to kind of ramp the timing in a little bit. You can, you know, some of these setups, you try to just put a bunch of timing in it from 2,000 RPM all the way up. When you roll into the throttle with a locked converter, again, a high stalled drag car where you're coming off a trans brake and you're always just at 5,000 RPM above, sure, you can lock the thing out, but on race gas. But something like this where it's going to be more dynamic, the torque converter is going to be locked. You're going to be driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour in 6th gear with the torque converter locked at 2,000 RPM, and you're going to want to be able to roll into the throttle without having it downshift. So you're going to be able to put some load on this thing. You got to build a timing curve that suits that on pump gas. So you'll hear audible knock if you put too much timing, even in a setup like this, down low. And so I'd still ramp the timing in a setup like this. And that's just for safety. That's just so we're not pinging, you know, we're not pinging the motor and hammering the motor with detonation. So yeah, so 31 down 2,700, you can see I'm just kind of ramping the timing up. And I'm not hitting peak timing till about 5,000 RPM, like I said. I did I did start out very soft on the timing on this thing, and we had a little bit of inductive delay that was pulling some timing back. So the first couple pulls on this were like mid 250s. It was like 250, 260 at the wheels, and I kind of knew there. I was like, all right, we can put some timing in this thing like a typical big block, but don't need to go crazy. There's no point. Again, another 8, 10 foot-pounds, 8, 10 horsepower is not going to make or break something here. So I'd rather have somebody be able to beat on it and have fun with it and not have to worry about it. But yeah, I got the air fuel. So you can see my closed loop correction is moving around a little bit here. So those two numbers here, that's the learn and the closed loop correction on the O2. There's 2%, 0, 0, 0. Yeah, so you can see I'm pretty close. I got my fuel table pretty much dialed in pretty nice. It's following that yellow line pretty nicely. So, yeah, I'm trying to think what else I would need to discuss on this. There's not a whole lot more there. This thing seems to be running even with the dyno fans, around 95 degrees. I'm assuming it's got a 195 thermostat in it, so I kind of adjusted the fans around that. But other than that, yeah, nothing, this is my fuel table so far. I do need to do some tweaking on the street with this. My learn table it's close, it's adding a little here. Yeah, but it's not far. I up here was doing some funky stuff, so you can maybe see if we look at the base fuel graph. So you can kind of see, but that's kind of typical of stuff like this with a cam and a single plane intake. You're going to kind of get to the waves and where this is pretty typical, where I still got to kind of maybe hit some of this stuff up in here. And if I rotate this a little bit, you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Maybe not that much. I'm going too far here. This might be a little fat in here, in this area here, but for a base table, I had some previous tunes from similar combinations for a starting point, and I'm working off that. So yeah, I will have to go drive this around in the street and make sure that this table is suitable for street use and all the dynamic situations you're going to get into on the street. Timing table, I know a lot of people get their jimmies in a bunch about a lot of timing on stuff cruising, but I find that when you have something that's cruising around, especially even a big block Chevy, when you're cruising around mid 40s, that's where they're happy. That's where you're going to have nice throttle response, just cruising down the highway. And this is 50 kPa and lower, so this engine is idling at 70 kPa, so you're really only in this range when you're really, really light throttle above 1800 RPM. Otherwise, from there you can see it's pulling timing. I've helped guys like this build timing tables like this, sent it to them, and then they send them to another tuner, and the other tuner, he's a race car guy, and he loses his lunch because he thinks 45 degrees of timing is going to blow the motor up, and it's like, well, that's at 58 kPa. That's cruising. That's light throttle. That's literally 15 to 20% throttle position, and the map sensor is, we're hardly loading the engine, and there's hardly any cylinder pressure, and they need a lot of lead, especially with a big chamber on a big block. So this is what I found to be. I'm going to go drive it around, play with this a little bit, maybe tweak it a little bit, but 45 is where they seem to like. And you can still try to achieve, again, this thing's not going to get 30 miles a gallon, but the difference between, if you had like this set to like 30 or 35, a lock distributor, and 45, you can get a couple, 3 more miles a gallon with something like this by giving it some more ignition lead in the cruising areas. So this is how I have this set up. I tend to on stuff like this where the idle's going to move around quite a bit, I tend to try to get the timing. Now I do have the timing adjustment for idle where it does adjust the timing, but in the table where it's going to reference, I'll try to leave big swaths of it here in the bottom. Again, big block and small block Chevys and, small block Fords and stuff. Some of the older architecture likes a lot of ignition timing versus an LS or a Coyote or something like that. They take quite a bit more timing, just the chambers are not as efficient. So, And I might tweak this a little bit. It's kind of cranking a little bit and kind of kicking back a smidge on cranking. It's got kind of a weak battery, so I might have to adjust the cranking timing in the Holly and some of this stuff up here when it first lights off, so it's not kicking back so hard. But again, this is part of the process. I'm only about, I'd say, 3/4 of the way done, maybe not even with this tune, because I still got to street drive it, got to do cold start, all that stuff. So the dyno is only about half of the process here. So especially when we got an automatic transmission to tune. So yeah, I'm nowhere near done with this tune. So this is where I'm at so far. This part of the table I'm not going to touch anymore, obviously. Probably up in here, this is where I want to be with the timing. But this little section of the table up here is all we're really looking at for the dyno. Not the rest of this is cruising and startup and idle and all the other things that we got to get dialed in. So yeah, that's where I'm at there. But otherwise, your typical Holly is just Holly Terminator. Probably the single most popular fuel injection system right now out there that guys are tweaking on, other than the stock stuff. Guys are doing stock truck stuff and stuff like that, Chevy trucks, LS stuff. This has got to be the most popular out there. I've done tons and tons of it, especially for street car stuff. A lot of different combinations for different kind of pro touring setups like this. So yeah, and I still got to go through some of the acceleration enrichment, get to throw the tip in better. Like I said, a lot of it right now is just kind of tweaking some of the injection timing and getting that dialed in as best it can be. And then from there, I'll go back and start nailing some of the other more common stuff. Making sure the fuel table, up in here is where it needs to be, and which I got this up pretty close. Like I rolled on one of the dyno pulls, I rolled onto it from like 1600, and the fueling up here is very close. So I have a pretty good idea of where it needs to be up in this range here, which can kind of be tricky to get, but this will affect how your car idles when it returns to idle and how it starts when you're fueling up in this area, the fuel table on these Hollies. Is when it lights off and it goes right to run mode, it's going to see a little bit of this. And sometimes when you're blipping the throttle from idle, the little bubble, if you watch it, it'll jump here before it comes up here. So it's going to reference some of this fueling up here. So before you start, if you're tuning one of these, before you start cranking up and down on your acceleration enrichment, make sure that this part of the table up here is close, because if it's not, it's going to affect your acceleration enrichment, because not only does it look at the acceleration enrichment settings, but it also, again, if you're idling right about here where this is idling 68 to 70 kPa at 800 RPM and you crack the throttle quick, it's going to see, the kPa is going to jump and it's going to reference this part of the table on top of the acceleration enrichment settings. So if this isn't correct, you're trying to correct it with acceleration enrichment, and it makes it easier if this is right. So just another trick I learned. Again, for some of you guys that are maybe starting out and taking tips from some of the stuff that I'm talking about, that's important. So yeah, you can see the table here is coming along pretty close. The wide open throttle stuff, like I said, you saw the data log with the air fuel up here is pretty close. A lot of this is just kind of extrapolated out. There's a little bit of, some holes down in here, and this might be a little too fat in here. Possibly I might have to take some out here, but I'll run it up on the street up and down a couple times, sweep it through the mid-range here, and with data log going and the learn table going, and I can kind of go back and look at that and see how close I am and make adjustments to that if needed. Yeah, otherwise this is for the dyno. This is wrapped up. I'm happy with where we're at. And just from here, it's shift points and just making sure it starts hot and cold and making sure it drives nice. So that'll wrap up for this one. Appreciate you guys watching. And again, make sure you guys are checking back on our social medias. I'll have more videos. I got a GT500 come up in the dyno tomorrow, so it'll be a video, another one of our 850 packages. And yeah, we'll get that one wrapped up too. So that'll do it for this one, guys. Appreciate you guys watching, and we'll talk to you guys later.